This vineyard was planted in 1992, and at that time there was just a vineyard across the road that just a couple of hectares had been planted the year before, but these two vineyards plus one other just a little bit lower down here were the first vineyards to be planted in the entire Cromwell Basin, which is Bendigo in the north, Bannockburn in the south, and Lowburn and Pisa in between, which now account for 70% of Central Otago's vineyards. So all of these vineyards have been planted since 92. So our wine industry is extremely recent. A couple of rows over where you get to the wooden posts, those vines there were from the original 92 plantings, so they're 27 years old, and so they are amongst the oldest vines in Central Otago. There's less than 10 hectares of vines of that age or older. So we're extremely young wine region compared to, say, classic regions in Europe, but even compared to, say, Australia, which has some of the oldest vines in the world in the Barossa Valley. We planted to 70% Pinot Noir, 20% Chardonnay, and 10% Riesling. Other varieties that you may have seen in Central Otago would be definitely Pinot Gris. Yep. And then there's just a handful of hectares of other things like Gewürztraminer, Sauvignon Blanc. But 80% of the Central Otago vineyard is planted to Pinot. 10 kilometres on the other side of that mountain range is the Gibbston area, where you were at Peregrine. And then 25 kilometres north of here, see the dark ridge from the mountain range up here as it goes down onto the horizon. That's Bendigo, just on the other side of that dark ridge. So 25 kilometres north. You're now in Bannockburn. Once you crossed over the bridge, we're at the southern end of the Cromwell Basin. And Bannockburn is one of the 7 sub-regions of Central Otago, and we have about 1/7 of the vineyard area. There's just over 300 hectares. There's about 2,000 hectares of vines in Central Otago.
This is one of the first plantings then, as you explained. Why plant here at that time? Because it was kind of a strange idea, wouldn't it have been?
Yeah, I mean, it was only in the early 70s that the government officials said the South Island wasn't suitable for vineyards. So now, I don't know, I think it's something like 70% of New Zealand's vineyard area would be in the South Island. Climate change has probably had a little bit to do with that, but that the effects of that probably weren't really started, being noticed until last 10 or a dozen years or so. General warming of the winters. If you talk to the old timers, the irrigation reservoirs, the dams that farmers used to irrigate their paddocks with, used to always freeze in the winter time, and you could go ice skating or curling on them. Whereas nowadays it's it's a pretty cold winter that you would have ice thick enough to curl on. Summers are, we can get in Central Otago we record the hottest daytime temperatures regularly of anywhere in New Zealand. So 33 to 38 degrees is not uncommon for us in the middle of summer. But equally, we can have a cold southerly come through and the temperatures drop down to well below 10. Last year on the 28th of January, we had 38 degrees in the vineyards. On the 1st of February, we had, which is the same as your 1st of August, we had snow halfway down the hills here, a foot deep, and the temperature in the vineyard the next morning was 4 degrees Celsius. So that is in the middle of summer, and that's normal for us. So climate change, there's going to be more variable weather. We're used to variable anyway because we're a tiny island in the cold Southern Ocean. So that's why we're a pretty tough skin as Kiwis. and we're good sailors because of the winds that we get.
But again, 30 or 40 years ago, the government says you shouldn't plant wines here, and yet someone did it. What kind of bug had bit this?
There was, everyone's got different stories. I mean, they're quite well documented in some of the, the books on the pioneers of Central Otago, people coming at it from different backgrounds. Our story is our founder, Stuart Elms, which is elm tree of our logo. He was a hotelier and had a restaurant and a fine wine shop in Dunedin. It was called the City Hotel. And Stuart had a love and it was part of his business of importing fine wine from Europe. So he knew what great wines of the world were all about, and he saw the emerging vineyards up in Marlborough in the 80s, well, in the late 70s, early 80s, and then the pioneering vineyards of Central Otago. The first commercial release was in 1987, and so he saw that and thought, a different project to get involved with. And he was 55 years old. Went to university, did a postgraduate diploma in viticulture enology, and then found this piece of land here. And back then it was real pioneering stuff, because you couldn't just sort of say, okay, well, it works for the next door neighbour. I'm guaranteed it's going to work here. So it was a bit of a risk, and there weren't that many vineyards and wines to have as benchmarks, or to say, is this going to be successful or not. So nowadays it's a lot easier if you can find an empty paddock next door somewhere and you go, well, it works here, there and there. It's like there's a pretty good chance it's going to work for me. So as long as you get everything in line. Yep. So we first vines planted 92. We have 3 other properties in Bannockburn, Mackmuir and Calvert, just a kilometre along the road. They're about 5 hectares each. And our Cornish Point Vineyards at the end of the base of the mountains over here. It's 6 kilometres away, but still in the Bannockburn sub-region, and in total 32 hectares of vines, and makes about 150,000 bottles, or 12,500 12-bottle cases for us. We started farming our vineyards organically back in 2002, and it took us about 3 years to figure it out, how best to work the soil and manage the undervine cultivation, and to be able to keep the weeds suppressed so that they don't compete too much for moisture and nutrition with the vines. And so by the end of 2005, we'd converted the entire vineyard area to organics, and also adopted biodynamics. So we're fully certified by Demeter as 100% organic and biodynamic.
Were you the first ones to do that? Because
No,
that sounds very early.
Ripon were organic in the early days. They sort of lost their certification sort of right about that time, 2001, 2002, but then gained it back a couple of years later. They were sort of until Nick Mills, the son, came home. There was one other just up the road, Caldwell Estate, that doesn't exist anymore. It's got sold off. And then elsewhere in New Zealand was, of course, Milton Vineyard up in Gisborne, which is a pioneer of biodynamics, not only in New Zealand but also in the world. He was one of the first vineyards practicing biodynamics in the world. So James has been a great mentor and a help, and the New Zealand wine industry is extremely collaborative. You can easily get on the phone and sort of call up James, buy him a plane ticket, and tell him to come down and have dinner with you, and sort of help and share information, and simply not on a consultancy basis, just on a purely on a basis to see others succeed, especially on the pathway to organics and biodynamics. And certainly Central Otago, because we all arrived here at about the same time. We're up against it, trying to establish vineyards, establish wineries, wine brands, sharing of equipment. It was and it still exists, that if I have a piece of equipment break down, it's like any one of my next door neighbours is going to come and help us out, or lend things, and likewise. So we're looking to start picking tomorrow, so long as this weather holds off.
You don't expect rain tomorrow here?
Well, we're not sure. I mean, it's a substantial front, and that's why I sort of mentioned about the 2 foot of rain they're expecting on the other side of the mountains. The Southern Alps are coming from sea level to 3,500 metres, and they provide an incredible rain barrier. So it just depends on the angle that the front has, and it's still a little too early to tell whether we're going to get rain out of it or not. But it may not be till later in the day. So I think we're planning to pick at this stage. The buckets we're getting laid out at Cornish Point at the moment. We've only had 1.5 millimetres so far today, so it's just enough to wash the dust off the grapes, which is nice. Give them a wash, free wash, and it's not enough to cause any concern.
So you will pick the Pinot Noir, or you pick the white?
We'll pick Pinot Noir at Cornish Point, and I just saw somebody right before, but one of the vineyard team, see the patch of vines down there, there's about 10 rows, 9 rows that are sort of a little yellow. They're Chardonnay vines that were just planted 2 years ago, and they've got 3 to 5 bunches on each, and because they're very young vines, the fruit's maturing quite quickly, so we may pick those on Wednesday. So there'll be a little bit of Chardonnay perhaps on Wednesday, but start with some Pinot tomorrow. And that's my cue
Alright,
because I've got to go down there. Somebody's taken the sample, so we'll get a sugar reading.
Yeah.
So just to confirm that the sugars are sufficient, I believe they are. But I want to go down and taste them because all of our picking decisions are made on the taste and the condition of the vine, the yellowing of the leaves. There's a bit of a signal that the fruit's going to be ready as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So-
Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you.